So this is the third in a series of 3 webinars. If you've missed the previous 2, the recordings are available online. We'll put a link in the chat where all the recordings will be, and there'll be recording for this one as well. And the focus for this webinar is designing online assessments specifically. And we have some Canvas colleagues from, well, not Canvas colleagues, but like Canvas, they use Canvas at the University of Technology, Sydney, to share their experience as Canvas practitioners around how they've designed online assessments and react to the needs and the changing needs of educators worldwide. And hopefully there will be a strong overlap between their needs and experiences and yours. So this is the main crew for the webinar today, except me. I'm just the host to kick things off. The stars of the show today are Jasper, Emerson, and Anne. Jasper, I think most of you know. He's the Director of Academic Support and Instructional Services and Technology at DLSU. Emerson and Anne are from the University of Technology, Sydney. Emerson is a learning design and technology specialist, and Anne is a senior curriculum designer. And as I said, in their line of work, they spend a lot of time working with academics, working with technology, working with other staff to develop innovative ways or necessary ways to transform or to do learning and teaching, particularly assessments online via Canvas and through other tools. So before we start, the recording link will be available after the event, so you don't have to worry about taking screen captures or screen recordings or things like that, and you will be able to share this with your colleagues who may not have been able to attend or, watch it again by yourself, which is what I do. We want you to introduce yourself in the chat, to use the chat, to have lots of conversations in the chat, which you are doing already, which is great. This is about you and what you need for your community and for, a part and opportunity for you to connect with others. So feel free to have those conversations in the chat or to ping others in the chat and share links and make it really active. Though if you have a specific question and you want us to address, we strongly recommend using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, because the chat's quite busy. So if you pop something in the Q&A, it'll be easier for us to identify that and respond to that directly. And one of the Canvas members, my teammates on this call, can also jump in and speak to you directly, right? So if you have a question for Jasper, Anne, or Emerson, pop it into the Q&A and they'll see it, or we'll find a way to get that question to them. Or if you have a Canvas question around a specific feature or a how-to or a specific, how do I turn this on or something like that? Can I find a guide for this? Pop that into the Q&A and we'll help you out with that. There may also be an opportunity towards the end, depending on how far we go, to ask questions yourself, to turn on the mic and jump in and be really, really interactive. So what we'll be doing today, we'll talk to you a little bit about the Canvas community broadly, the bigger global Canvas community. And then we'll talk specifically about the Philippines Canvas user group, of which all of you are part of already. And then we'll get to the highlight of today's session, which is talking about how to design online assessments. And then we'll try to save about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A, right? But like I said, if you have questions before that, pop them into the Q&A session of this webinar. So on the global Canvas community, there is what we like to do or pride ourselves in Canvas and continuously work towards is different ways to empower you, right? Canvas is a product, it's a platform, it's a tool, but the users of Canvas are the ones who really make the difference, because you are the ones who not only just put the content there and use it to teach students and interact with students and build learning, but you also drive how we develop and grow the product. And that's what the community is about, really. On the community, we have content which we think will help you understand how to best use Canvas. So guides, webinars, newsletters that highlight different things customers are doing. And it becomes a bit of a platform for you to share the amazing things that you do. I learn about Canvas from you, from going through the community and looking at the questions customers have asked and other customers have responded to. largely. So we really want to make sure that you know that community is there and to really encourage you to get into that community. And that's also a place for where you can learn more about what's coming up with Canvas through the roadmap, looking at the release notes, right? If you haven't subscribed to the release notes yet, I'd strongly recommend you subscribe to those release notes. You get in your email a highlight of what's coming up with Canvas in the next month or so, or even the next few months, depending on how early those features are pushed out with some of the features, and little tips and guides and more information on how you can use them. Okay, so get on that community. On the Philippines Canvas community specifically, it's an extension here now online around how the activities which you as a community used to do and will continue to do when we can, meet people and not wear masks and hug each other more than we do now in a post-COVID sort of environment. But the core message there is that what we like to do as Instructure is encourage you to connect with each other and build upon the interactions and the knowledge that you share as a community. The context of how what it's like to teach and build content in the Philippines, what a Filipino student might be interested in, the legislation, the needs, the demands, the interests are things which you understand far better than anyone else, and really build on that knowledge with each other and to grow on it. And anything that we can do as Instructure to help you facilitate that community, we're all ears and eyes and noses to really understand how we can help you. But to talk more about the community and really share some of that insight, I want to invite Dr. Jasper to the floor, and I'm hand the microphone to him virtually so that he can share a little bit more about the community.
Thank you very much, Logan. Okay, for that quick overview. Okay, so as Logan said, we are a strong community here in the Philippines. At the moment, there are, I think, 44 institutions as part of the Canvas Philippines users. Okay, and really we have three primary objectives and advocacies, which is first to serve as a networking group, and particularly to share our best practices. Okay, as we know, our context here in the country is much different from other countries. Okay, we have a lot of our conversations are focused on how can we combat, for example, the lack of infrastructure for our institutions and our students, especially at this time of the pandemic. Okay, but we also share best practices across different topics, and that was really one of the triggers why we decided to have our webinar series. And as Logan mentioned, this is our third one for this year. The second is to really advocate impact as a voice for region. Okay, so each of the members of the network do have their own challenges, but it's heard better if we consolidate all of these common challenges and relay it to Canvas. So, and then finally, to provide feedback for Canvas products and roadmap. So we have recommended some features and some functionalities that we see are relevant, especially in the Philippine context. So these are the members of the Canvas Philippine User Group Committee. We have Sir Jason De Villa from the University of Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Rosel Basa from the University of the East, Ling McDermott from Far Eastern University, Sir Guion Favela from Jose Rizal University, Ms. Maria Aguila from University of the Philippines, Manila, and myself from De La Salle University. Okay. So I guess without further ado, let us go ahead and we can give the floor to our speakers who will talk about, I think, one of the lingering questions and continuing challenge, especially in the Philippine context, which is designing online assessment at the University of Technology, Sydney. So I'll give the floor now to Miss Ann Wilson and Mr. Emerson Sonardi of UTS.
Thank you, Jasper. Hi, everyone. Thank you for, I would like to first thank you, I guess, Instructure for the opportunity for us to share some of our experiences and learnings around moving our assessments online. It's one of my, I think, like second webinar within this group. So I think, yeah, hopefully this will be relevant within your situation. And yeah, we look forward to sharing our findings. What I might do is I might just confirm, can everyone just see my screen at the moment?
Yes, we can.
Terrific. So I guess today, as Jasper was saying, we are sort of talking a little bit about, what our experiences were with designing online assessments at UTS. A lot of these experiences are going to talk about what we did in 2020 as we suddenly shifted from face-to-face and sort of online activities to fully online. So who we have today, just really quickly, is that before I sort of begin, I did want to introduce the presenters or introduce who we are in a bit more detail. So who we have today is we do have we do have Ann Wilson here, who is our senior curriculum designer in our Institute of Interactive Media and Learning. And did you want to give a quick introduction?
Sure, thanks, Emerson. Yeah, I'm Ann Wilson. I work at as an academic developer at UTS, and thanks. I have been working in higher education for over 30 years and working in an online sense since the mid-90s, so quite a long time. I teach at UTS on the graduate certificate in higher education in teaching and learning, and my research interest is in assessment and feedback.
Terrific, thanks, Anne. And just a quick introduction to myself. So I am a learning designer and technology specialist within the Learning Experience Lab at UTS. My main role, I guess, within the university is looking at how we sort of implement our learning technologies in line with our learning and teaching frameworks and other governance requirements that sort of come up from our other divisions. So really working closely with various stakeholders across the university to deliver initiatives using learning technologies. So just for the agenda for today, what we'll be covering off are predominantly 4 things. So Anne will be sort of unpacking a little bit in terms of what makes a good assessment. So before we even, I guess, talk about how we sort of move things online and the considerations around online assessment design, we did want to sort of unpack that in a bit more detail. We'll be running through some considerations around when you are moving assessments online, what are some important sort of factors to consider, how we as a university support the design of online assessments. So what do we do, I guess, from a teaching and learning support unit. And last but not least, some of the lessons learned from last year and what we'll be taking moving forward, and hopefully sort of resonate within this community. So in terms of the outcomes we want to achieve by the end of this session, we do hope that you do take a few things away. So hopefully there are some considerations around good assessment designs that you could potentially implement within your own institutions. Hopefully some of the experiences around how we support our teachers can inform how you may want to implement these sort of same initiatives within your own institutions. And last but not least, some of the lessons that we learned, good and bad, whether they're applicable or not, hopefully these will be able to help inform how we could sort of transition to better practices with going to more remote teaching sort of environments. So without further ado, I might just kick off. So essentially where I want to begin is just to go and give everyone a bit of a background information about our institution. So it was established in 1988, and since it has been established, it has grown leaps and bounds. So in terms of the size of our...
Sorry, Emerson, you might like to go to slide 6. It's not changed on our screen.
Oh, apologies. Is that working now?
No, I can only see the opening slide.
I think it's on slide number 1.
Give me 1 second. I'm in presentation view, so I think the transitions are not coming across for some odd reason. So let me reset that real quick. So I do apologize. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to quickly reset that.
There we are.
There we go.
Can you see my screen at the moment?
Yeah.
Terrific. So we are quite a young institution. So just going back a few steps, we were established in 1988, and since then we have sort of grown quite a bit. So in terms of our institution, we are, I guess, a fairly standard university in terms of size. So we have about 45,000 students across coursework and research and HDI and whatnot, with about 15,000 of those being international students. We do have about 4,000 staff in total, so it is across all the various faculties. So it is there is quite a large workforce behind this university, and I guess since then we have grown quite quickly and quite strongly within Australia. And in the most recent QS Top rankings, we have been ranked as #1 in Australia, which is a really huge achievement for the university. In terms of what we teach in the curriculum and whatnot, we do have about 150 undergraduate degrees across the university, and also about 240 postgraduate courses across traditional and emerging disciplines. So just to give you a bit of flavor in terms of our institution and what context we're working within. And we would like to really preempt this presentation to talk about last 2020 and how we were able to sort of move to supporting online assessments online. So really quickly, in 2020, I'm sure that the whole world in general has gone through a lot of different challenges. We went through our own challenges with moving to online remote learning very quickly. And as a result, we did sort of go through a very quick transition to, we did have to do a lot of quick transitions to inform our users in terms of good practices around designing their assessments online, what they could be doing around engaging the students online. As you can see over here, it was quite a jam-packed session. And I think fortunately, one of the reasons why we were able to do that was that we were in the middle of a large change. So even before the whole situation, just to give everyone a bit of context, we were already going through a large change management process where we were moving from Blackboard to Canvas. And what this has meant for our institution was that it sort of meant that we have had a very wide organizational ownership in terms of committing to this change. We had the ability to sort of look at how we could reprioritize changes and sort of deliver on remote teaching initiatives. And last but not least, because we were in the midst of this change in 2019 to 2020, we had a lot of resources and capabilities and capacity, I guess, as a whole, to execute that change. So that's sort of a bit of context around what our university was and what sort of happened last year. I might hand the mic over to Anne now, who will take us through what makes a good assessment.
Thanks, Emerson. So welcome, everyone. What makes a good assessment? Well, we thought we'd start with this. There's a lot to get through here, and this is guidance rather than authority, but it comes out of the scholarship of learning and teaching and writing around what makes good assessment. And one of the things I'd like to say first up is that by moving our assessment online, we don't disregard any of these principles of what make good assessment. That all still applies. But the challenge, I think, is that many of us have come through systems where assessment hasn't been online. And whereas we've used as a model for our teaching our experience as learners, so in our face-to-face teaching, we've thought about and reflected on our experience in classrooms ourselves. Moving online is often for many a new challenge. You haven't learnt online, you haven't done an assessment yourself online. And that might be something to think about. Take a MOOC, have a go, have a look at online and think about how that might impact you. So I think this is a good starting point. Have the next slide. So we thought we'd look at sort of the influences on assessment design and what happens here at UTS. So if I start at that black box down at the bottom, the subject assessment strategy, and that's where most of us are working within a subject. At UTS, the subject assessment strategy is determined and a reflection on the course assessment strategy. So subjects sit within courses and courses sit within schools and faculties. And here at UTS, the faculty determine a set of graduate attributes that then have to be reflected within the course and within the subject. And assessment needs to align with those graduate attributes. So there is an oversight there around that subject assessment strategy, and you see them impacting on that. And then to the left of the diagram are the university structures that have something to say about assessment. So at UTS, and I'm sure in your institutions too, you have an assessment policy and governance of assessment. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it talks about the amount of assessment you might expect, the issues around fairness, marking and feedback. Second on that list is the academic integrity policy and procedures. And it's a very clear policy about what is and it is academic integrity, and therefore, by definition, what is academic dishonesty, and what the policy might be if someone is caught cheating in their assessments. We also have a great deal of teaching and learning support, and we'll talk about that a bit later, around supporting teachers in moving online, in developing their resources online, in teaching and assessing online. And below that is the student support. Lots of support for students, not just international students who might have a challenge using English, but all students, in terms of students helping each other in formal and informal ways, support for students in unpacking what assessment requires, what it means, what the rubric means, and so on. So lots of provided university structures that talk to assessment. And then on the right are some considerations. So the literature is full of some principles of good assessment, and there's a general consensus around what that might be. Along with that are the discipline requirements, and some courses here at UTS have requirements from the accrediting body that they have to have certain types of requirement delivered in particular ways. Then there's the delivery mode, the platform affordances. Accessibility issues around assessment, and fairness is a deal here, accreditation requirements and so on. So lots of things to think about. That black box in the middle isn't just a creative place to play in, but it also has a number of things to consider and weigh up. Okay, so I think this is not an unimportant thing to think about what assessment speaks to, and why is it important. It's where students put their energy, and in a survey of students at a university in the UK, they analysed what time they spent out of class working on their course, and they found that they spent 97% of the time out of class working on the assessment. So only 3% of the time that they spent was on other things. So digging deeper, looking across at things, maybe doing the readings. Their assessment drove their learning. So assessment as learning is a phrase that we're using often, and recognizing that students spend a lot of time on assessment, and that's where they get their payback, and that's why this is important. It gives you feedback on the quality of your teaching. So you might like to think, if the students all didn't do so well in the assessment, then what was your part in that? So that's an important thing. It might also give you feedback on the quality of your assessment. And we'll talk about alignment a little in a few minutes. But also it speaks outside the institution about the quality of your qualifications and awards. So assessment of learning, and those two things, assessment as learning and assessment of learning, are important ways to think about assessment, how you capture students' time and energy, and how you have evidence of their learning, and how that speaks to employers and so on. So this is a cartoon perhaps many of you have seen, and I think it's a good one to think about those kind of general principles of what makes good assessment. The question here is this fair? So the examiner on the right is saying, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam, please climb that tree. And then looking at the lineup of candidates to climb the tree, you can see that some of them might have severe difficulties in doing that. Perhaps the goldfish and the seal, and the penguin and the elephant might have a bit of a problem, and maybe the chimpanzee has a bit of an unfair advantage. So this is the question we need to ask. Is our assessment fair? The other questions that go along with this is it valid? Is it doing what it says it does? Is it assessing what it's claiming to assess? Is it reliable? Will you use it in a number of situations? Will we be making judgments? Will the markers be using the same judgments to mark that assessment? And it's not just setting the assessment, but marking and making judgments about the evidence you provided with, which is an important element of all this. And then, is it aligned? Is it constructively aligned? And we'll look at that in a minute. So the question about what makes good assessment and interrogating your assessment in line with that. So constructive alignment, I just mentioned this, comes out of the constructivist way of thinking about learning and teaching and the active role that learners play in that. So in a way, it seems self-evident. It's work from Biggs and Tang in 2011, and they updated it again in 2017. But it says that what we teach, the way we teach it, and the way we assess it are all aligned. And in a way, you think, well, what's new about that idea? Well, the newness of it, the novelty of it, is that students construct their understanding of it. And that's what they present you with in the assessment. So you want to be clear that the assessment you're setting them is aligned with the learning outcomes you describe and the way that you've taught it, both in the formative assessment that you provided in the subject and in the summative assessment that you provide at the end. So this slide looks at Bloom's taxonomy, and hopefully you're very familiar with the ideas presented here. But Bloom's taxonomy is, I think, a very useful tool in thinking about assessment. I think it was actually put together as a marking scheme, but it's useful in that it looks at, because it's a taxonomy, each of those levels is predicated on the one before. So knowledge is that basic naming of parts. What are things called? Naming things. That sort of basic lowest level of cognitive learning. Comprehension builds on that you understand what it does, what it's for, how it works. Application is being able to apply that, and analysis is about taking things apart. Synthesis, putting them back together, and evaluation, problem solving, that top end, those high levels of thinking, and maybe what we're aiming for in higher education. And there underneath are the kinds of questions that sit with those. So this is a good way of identifying what that level of assessment is that you're looking for. And you'll want to align this with your learning outcomes, what you've set out to teach, and therefore, what are you assessing? So, for example, if you are actually setting an evaluation level learning outcome, you'll want to be sure that students have covered off the knowledge and comprehension levels, the application and analysis and synthesis before they do the test, the assessment piece in evaluation. And you might like to think about formative assessment happening along these levels. And there's a great opportunity in online learning to provide those kind of opportunities for formative assessment where students can test how well they're going along this journey from knowledge through to evaluation. Now, we've included this because it's a bit of on that left, some questions around making good assessment design, making good decisions about assessment design. But this is a readily available guide and quite good in terms of taking you through that process. Suggest you begin with the learning outcomes. What's the verb indicating? And that's where the Bloom's taxonomy is a very useful piece of technology to use there. And then what evidence could your students show that they have achieved this outcome? And I like to talk about assessment as evidence of student learning. And if we think of it in that way, then we can think more broadly about what kind of evidence they can show. And then, of course, there is the context of your discipline. And very importantly, how you'll provide feedback. Feedback is the other half of assessment, and thinking about how you will deliver feedback, how you will make commentary on students' evidence, and how they might engage with that feedback and use it, not just in, feel like we're hampered by the language a bit, feedback, whereas actually we want to talk about feed forward. How will they use your comments on their work to improve what they do next time? And that might be not next time in your subject, but next time in your course. And one question I ask a lot of academics around assessment, when they ask about the trials and tribulations of marking and giving feedback, I say, what are you giving the feedback for? When will the students use this commentary of yours again? Do you know when they'll find this useful? So have a think about that in your design too. So online assessment design. And we thought that it was important to start with the kind of general principles, because we're familiar with that, aren't we? That you've been designing and developing assessment in your face-to-face courses for some time. And as a learner, you have probably done lots of assessment in your courses you've done to bring you to this point in your career. But maybe you haven't done much online assessment. So we're just looking at that sort of a new way of working. Thanks. So some of the things, some of these are great affordances offered by online learning. Some of these might be some things that we need to think more carefully about. So starting in that top left-hand corner, we've got access to the World Wide Web. So there are all sorts of sources of information. You may be familiar that MIT put all their course material online. They said that content was dead. It's all there on the internet. We can find out anything we want. But the thing that makes us unique in education is that we can design assessment that will test whether a student has got it. So that we don't have to be so wedded to our content in the way that we were before. It's not private, it's not ours alone, it's shared, it's out there. So that's something to think of in terms of perhaps research skills you might get students to be doing in their assessment. You might be involved in a number of different skills in assessment than you were when you were running face-to-face courses, particularly sort of closed book exams compared to open book exams, perhaps. So, oh, sorry, let me go back. Got loads to say about this. Then we got the access to multimedia, other learning platforms. We've used YouTube in assessment. We've used many different kind of sources of multimedia in assessment, something to think about. And then that top right, the authenticity of work submitted. This is a bit of a challenge here, and this is perhaps something that is a bit of a stumbling block as we go. And we'll talk about that in a minute, about some of those issues around plagiarism and academic integrity. The content accessible on and offline. Sharing is just one click of a button away, and we do have examples of students sharing material, sharing online questions. Doesn't always work in their favor, but there's a lot of challenges around that, and the whole issue around remote learning and students being perhaps on their own and concerned about their assessment and the challenge that's offered. And we have used some proctoring arrangements. I think Emerson will talk about that in a bit. So formative and summative assessment, the kind of two sides of the same coin. Formative assessment is all that feedback we give students as they have a go, test their learning, see how they're going, and develop their understanding, refine their understanding, confirm their understanding. Formative assessment can be as simple as a question in class. You know, put up your hand if you think X. Or the answer to this is X, and so on. Summative assessment has some feedback involved in it too, but it generally has marks attached to it. So in our courses, for example, our assessment policy says that you can have 3 pieces of assessment in any course, and that would be 3 pieces of summative assessment. They'd each have a mark to them, and there'll be an expectation that feedback would be provided on them. Generally, feedback isn't provided on exams, but in all other forms of assessment, feedback's provided. Formative assessment is the feedback. So there are many ways that we deliver formative assessment, and there are many opportunities of it in online assessment. Thanks. So I just mentioned this, but not over-assessing students was important, providing timely feedback. And we've talked about providing authentic assessment, and UTS signed up to an authentic assessment agreement around a number of universities in Australia. Authentic assessment is assessment more closely aligned with what you'd see in the workplace, the kind of assessment, the kind of activity you'd expect people to see. And I could give an example would be that we often give essays, which are probably a most inauthentic form of assessment. I've never in my working life been asked to write an essay, but I have been asked to write a report. And so a report might be a more authentic piece of assessment than an essay. So the thinking around authentic assessment, it doesn't guarantee academic integrity, but it does move it closer towards academic integrity. One of the reasons being the thought that you can't readily Google the answer. The other might be that students are much more engaged when they see a task is authentic, something like they might be asked in the workplace to do. And so then they may be more readily willing to do the task. And that might be useful. And then promoting academic integrity. Sorry, thanks, Emerson. So feedback, I mentioned it earlier, but it certainly is the other part of assessment. And one of the things we are looking at UTS is how we can deliver feedback using the online environment, you know, using the audio opportunities afforded by the online, that we can give audio feedback. We can give commentary to students. We can encourage them to review their own work and develop their self-feedback and then peer review. And many of these activities are, you know, there's provision within the Canvas infrastructure to do that. And these are things that are perhaps more simply done online than they are in a face-to-face setting. So something to think about around that. So these are some tips for online assessment that we have identified. One of the biggest challenge, I would say, I'm sure Emerson would agree, around moving to online last year was that we had to move very quickly. We had to, that word pivot, from face-to-face to online in a very short time. And at that time, we had a very large number of exams that were invigilated. That means they were closed book. They were in one central location. We had invigilators walking around the exam room, ensuring that students were not cheating and were doing the exam as was expected. And a lot of people were quite wedded to that method of assessment. And for many of our programs, they provided 50% of the assessment was in the last week of a course, and required no feedback at all, and students were required to memorize and replicate their answers in that setting. Very stressful for lots of people. I think that many students that I've talked to have actually actively chosen courses that didn't have an exam like that because they thought that would be a less stressful way of being assessed. So it is a kind of very, very difficult and challenging and anxiety-provoking form of assessment. So we asked them to consider, we asked people to consider, our academics to consider other forms of assessment and open book assessment. This is, you could click on this to look at the resource. Have we got time to do that, Emerson? I think we might.
Yep, sure. And we also have one live question around what does authentic assessment mean? So we can go through that very shortly, I think in dot point number 3, Anne, but I'll open the link and show what we have.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, can everyone see my screen at the moment where I've changed the page or since we moved on to a new page?
Yeah, I can.
Terrific. So these are examples of different resources and blogs that we actually provide to our academics and our community to kind of inform them of better, inform them of good practice. So there's never best practice, but different sort of considerations as part of their design. So this is just one of numerous articles, but this was one that we referred to quite heavily in terms of getting people to think about what they could do around open book assessments, what they need to be mindful of, and going back to what Anne was saying, a lot of it is still going to be built around the foundation of what is a good assessment and what are the assessment design principles that you need to be mindful of. So this is just one example. We did include a couple of examples within our slides, which I believe is going to be shared after this session. So if you'd like to sort of dig around and see what other sort of practical tips that we have shared with our community, you're welcome to do so. Back to you, Anne.
Thanks, Emerson. So yeah, we looked at that. We also developed the decision tree to help people decide, in fact, whether they in fact needed a closed book invigilated exam. And we've got that chart there. I think that's probably fine. Where we asked them whether in fact they needed to keep that exam, whether they'd already tested and assessed all the learning outcomes in their program sufficiently to provide enough evidence of learning, and then whether and then what some alternatives might be that they might consider to substitute for the closed book invigilated exam. We were left at the end of it with a small number of courses. Do you want to click on the decision tree? Yeah. So this was to help our academics in deciding whether they have to do it. And our first question was, have you actually done enough assessment already? And if you have, you can just reweight your assessments. And we had a decision by the university that the assessment policy wouldn't require a formal process in changing the weighting of assessments. We would allow that to happen at a school and faculty level, making those decisions. And then, if you could reshuffle some of your learning outcomes and feel that you had covered enough. So if you think of assessment of evidence of learning, the question was, have you got enough evidence? And if you have, then you don't need to go on and do an exam. And then can you redesign your exam, maybe to have a different kind of exam? So if you can, then we move through that list on the left about whether you're doing calculations. You might do some handwritten calculations. Are you doing a case study? You might do that a little bit differently. Do they need to describe, discuss, or explain? Then we provide some options, analysing a diagram, giving a presentation. So we provided some alternatives around that and some suggestions. Many of those were taken up. A lot of academics were quite happy to move to another form of assessment, final assessment. And interestingly, many of them have stayed with that alternative. And then if they couldn't, we asked whether the exam could be, did it have to be invigilated? Did it have to be closed book? Could it be open book with some digital resources and so on? And so we came to a few AI invigilated exams, and but that was a much smaller number. I don't know, do you want to say something about this, Emerson?
Yep. So from an operational perspective, now that we sort of have ran online assessments or online exams for the past year and a half, we have seen a drastic reduction in how many of our academics are opting to run online exams and instead opting for alternative exams. So just for a bit of context, I think from recollection, we had about 40,000 exam sittings in autumn 2020. That has since dropped drastically, I think about 10,000 sittings, but I might need to clarify that number, so please don't hold me against that. But we do know that there's been a drastic reduction this session around the need to have a formal examination, even if it's online.
Thanks. And then we talked about giving students some support around, particularly around open book exams. I know when I've observed students going into open book exams, I've seen them with huge numbers of resources that they feel that they can access during the exam. So you need to really talk to students about what sort of resources they need, because the point of an exam is it's timed. It's not endless like an essay or any other form of assessment might be. So it can happen it happens in a time. So taking in a huge number of resources for an open book exam really puts you on the back foot. And then we're talking about authentic assessment. We might just click on that slide back to slide 22, Emerson. Yeah, so the authentic assessment principles. So this is what you can access this, but the idea is that these are real tasks, and they're talking about them motivating students, and the thought is that that maybe has some impact on students who might cheat on their assignments, is that this is maybe something that is difficult to Google the answer for, but they also might be more connected with it because it speaks very much to where they might be going in terms of employment. So authentic is that it's something that has a real life practice, it will happen in a real life practice setting. So, often you might be giving an oral report rather than a written report. You might be making a pitch for a film production. I'm reading right down at the bottom of that page. You might be offering a report to your supervisor or so on. So there's lots of ideas around this, and in your discipline you would know what kinds of things might be more authentic for those disciplines. I think the challenge is around the arts and social sciences to find authentic assessment, but I think a rule of thumb might be to think about the sorts of things you have been asked to do in your work, and think about what those might be and what those real life scenarios and problems might be, and therefore what the evidence of learning might be in that situation. And then that last one on the slide is that is to talk about academic integrity and assessment security. And my advice is to talk about it, to tell students you know about it, to tell them you have a clear policy, that you frown on it, that it's not something to be encouraged in this setting, that it devalues all their qualifications if people cheat, and that there are clear things that will happen if you're caught cheating. There'll be consequences for this behavior. So if you'd just like to click on that, Emerson, I think we've got a little bit there. So some ideas there about deterring contract cheating, in there. But certainly, you know, changing your exam questions, changing your assignment questions, talking to students about this, perhaps making them a bit more authentic and real, and make it clear that this is not a good idea, and this could have long-term consequences, that the challenge they have in delivering things on time or you know, in the required format are small compared to the ongoing consequences if they're caught cheating. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Anne. And something I want to highlight is that there is a lot of information in those resources that we sort of have on our public domain. So I think we're just trying to call out the key ones, but if you do dig into them, there are a lot of steps and strategies that were thought of well in advance as part of the move to online assessment. So I think Anne, you did a really great job trying to summarize all those bits of information. It's a lot, there is a lot in there.
Thanks. Okay, so here's some tips about online assessment. So you could consider devising questions that require students to apply and make use of information through analysis or evaluation. So if you're thinking of that around that Bloom's taxonomy, it's a useful thing to think about the alignment. At what level are you teaching? And therefore, at what level should, you know, do your questions need to be fixed? So that recall of information, that remembering, so on, is not such a useful way to go. Thinking about your questions in the form of a problem, scenario, or case study. And a case study can be a really rich source of questions. You can use multiple choice questions with case study, and some quite high order ones are useful and very challenging way of going. Of course, a question pool. So randomization and calculated formula questions, a good way to ensure that students aren't sharing their questions with each other. So a randomized set of 20 multiple choice questions coming from a pool is a good way to go. And just check that you haven't got too many recall-based question types, but think about that high order thinking and examining at the highest level that your learning outcomes are written at.
So thank you, Anne, for running through sort of, you know, some of the exam design principles that we have at UTS, as well as what we sort of have done to inform our users around considerations around when they are moving online. What I'll be going through these slides is what are some of the support pillars that we do within the university to sort of support design of online assessment. So this is really looking at all the sort of behind the scenes mechanisms that enable this. So real quick, being part of the, I guess, teaching and learning support team, our main mechanism of support to sort of help academics move online are predominantly done through 3 pillars. Those 3 things being that we do facilitate and run a lot of different workshops around how they should be, you know, designing things or building things online. We do run a lot of different kind of events with other universities. We do run them a lot with our department of faculty to kind of share different sort of best practices within the community. We have a pretty comprehensive resource and blog page on the public domain, so that essentially it is really readily accessible to all staff and students. Oh, sorry, not students, but all staff. And we also have blogs, which is quite open. It's quite what's that word? Inclusive, in the sense that we don't put anything, we don't block people, we don't put anything in place to stop academics from sharing their best practices. So as long as you go onto the website and you sign in, you are able to publish your own articles and share it within the UTS community. Last but not least, we do have a bit more of a traditional support mechanism, which is quite standard. So we do have a lot of different ways we support faculties, which we'll go through very shortly. So to put it into perspective, in terms of the workshop events that we do, some key things I'd like to highlight from our teaching and support team is that we do run a lot of training workshops that run on a cycle within sessions. And we only mostly cover centrally supported learning tools, such as Canvas, Turnitin, and so forth. So we do really keep the scope within what we do have. And if there are any sort of things that we need to address, we sort of look at different workarounds within the centrally supported learning tool ecosystem. We do run a series of themed webinars with the wider teaching and learning team. So we do work with Anne's team quite a lot, which is teaching curriculum. We do work with faculties to sort of run all sorts of different themed webinars. And these webinars or events could be hosted by faculties, other departments, and so forth. And not just that, it can also be run by subject matter experts from other institutions too. So it is quite a diverse, I guess, offering in a sense, and it is at the moment all offered online. In terms of resources, I think every institution do resources a little bit differently, and how we sort of approach it is all about accessibility and ease of searchability. But we do, on our public domain, we do design all our resources to ensure that they are consistent in the design and structure, so that as an end user or as an academic, when you go into any of the different collections that we have on various topics or themes, it's easy to digest. A lot of the resources that we design and write up, and I do apologize, I don't have an example right here for you right now. We do ensure that they are sort of reusable so that they can be implemented across a wide array of activities, whether that be a workshop that we're running, a consultation that was done, or an online ticket that was done through ITSC or IT. We do make them sort of chunk them and sort of make them really accessible in that respect. And we also align them to a lot of our teaching and learning frameworks at the university, focusing a lot on tips and good practices around how you could sort of adopt this within an online environment or within the technology affordance itself. Last but not least, sustainable, debatable, but we like to think it is a bit sustainable so far, and we have made it intentionally very easy to access and searchable. So if you do go onto our website, which I'm very happy to share afterwards, you can actually find a whole bunch of different resources that we do within UTS around advising our community around best practices around technology, or sorry, maybe not best practices, but considerations around how you could use technology and the affordances around that. I did put resources and blogs on the same sort of pillar in terms of what support we provide our community, but I did want to call out that our blogs are very open-ended. We do take a very, just to repeat, we do take a very inclusive approach, similar to how we work with, similar to potentially a community of practice of sorts. But we do allow our academics to sort of write and create their own blogs and share them with the wider community, so that we do get a diverse range of disciplines, providing their perceptions and commenting on different articles and sharing best practices, which is great. So it opens up a lot of open discourse around faculties. And what we do with the blogs is that we do make sure that we communicate them accordingly, whether that be featuring and trending articles, and make sure that we include them as formal, maybe not formal, but including them as part of other university communications too, so that, again, it's another engagement strategy we use to ensure that people are sort of kept on top of all the latest trends, the latest texts, latest tools which are available. So, for example, recently we've introduced Multimedia into our ecosystem. We make sure that we include as much variety and include as many channels as possible to ensure that that information is shared. And last but not least, I think with the blogs, as part of that inclusive approach, I think as a channel to communicate teaching and learning practices, technology, news and whatnot, it is quite a responsive channel where we are able to turn around things very quickly. So this did, our director or our team was quite strategic in the sense of making it so that, if we did have to communicate anything on the day, it's quite easy to go through, and we've removed as many blockers as possible to ensure that the information gets to the end user or gets to our academics. Last but not least, support. So I don't think this is nothing too unique, but what we do at UTS to help support, I guess, our users going online, whether that be assessment, subject design, and so forth. There are predominantly 6 main things that we do, and I will talk about one in a bit more detail, which is more Anne's bread and butter. But we do a lot of one-on-one consultations, whether that be in person or in Zoom. We do have this goes in infrastructure, but we do have infrastructures for online ticketing systems and live chat, so that academics can come in and engage in real time online. We do have tailored faculty support packages, which are done accordingly in line with the appropriate department heads, or as we call it, associate deans of teaching and learning. We do sort of tailor things accordingly by faculties and disciplines. We do have a dedicated educational media support team that's going to help out with recordings, how you could sort of deliver your instructions online, what you need to do around that. This is not specifically something we do, but out of all the pillars that seem to make the most sense, we do also offer professional development courses formally through the grad cert, which Anne Wilson's team sort of provide. So as a university, it is a support mechanism in the sense that if you did want to improve your teaching and learning practices formally and get that acknowledged, they are able to take up development courses. And did you want to add anything on top of that by any chance?
No, that's good. A good summary.
Terrific. And last but not least, I think again, probably not unique once again, but we actually work very closely across all our support teams and stakeholders. So whilst we, so this may include student support providers, mentors, careers, libraries, exams, and so forth. So whilst we don't do things like administer exams, so we don't actually do any of that. We do have a dedicated exam unit, sort of looking at looking at that as a whole from an administrative perspective. We do work with them in terms of embedding our process in their processes to ensure that from a teaching and learning perspective, a lot of these considerations are put in place. So a lot of those decision trees, which Anne showed earlier, a lot of the strategies around academic integrity, we make sure we sort of embed them as part of processes, so that it's bringing these issues forward and letting our end users know. So that's sort of on the support side of things. I don't think there's anything too unique in that respect, but this is sort of what we do within our context and how we sort of shifted online quite quickly last year. And as part of that, in terms of lessons learned from our experiences, there are predominantly three things, and I've tried to sum them up as best I could, but I guess our key takeaways is that it is going to be always an ongoing improvement process. All of this is iterative. There's no best practice. There's always consideration of how we could do things better. We have seen a huge uplift in our community in terms of digital literacy skills, in terms of how they build assessments online and how they look at alternative assessments. But we are always going to have a group of academics or a community of people that needs additional help, more or less. So it is an ongoing improvement process, and this is there will be iterations of this. Another key takeaway in terms of moving, I guess, a lot of our sort of teaching and learning activities online, including assessments, is that we've noticed a lot of generosity from the wider community. So within our public domain on UTS, we have noticed a lot more articles going up, a lot more people sharing practices, a lot more people talking about what they do in their disciplines and sharing more broadly, and having sort of an open discourse, in various different forums. So we have noticed that people are always willing to share and help when they can. So really, we do have a very positive teaching and learning community here. And last but not least, another key takeaway, which is a bit more on the part that we still need to work on as well, is that by moving online, it has raised awareness of different social issues around online learning. So how do we sort of engage with students that are in remote learning? What are some of the accessible considerations around design in terms of how we present our content? How do we make sure that students feel comfortable when they're doing the examinations online, and what is the consent process in that? So there are a lot of things which has sped forward or sort of quickly, that was sort of raised as part of this shift online really quickly. And it sort of affords a lot of opportunities moving forward in terms of areas that we want to work on and improve. So I might go back to Anne real quick in terms of key takeaways, but in terms of lessons learned from our experiences of moving assessments online, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that's good. I think that was our summary. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. So I think that's pretty much the end of our sort of spiel in terms of what we've done around shifting a lot of our teaching and learning activities online, including assessments. The only thing that I might highlight, as I mentioned earlier, is that if you did want to look at what other strategies, what other stuff practices that we share within our community, we are quite open. A lot of our resources are on the public domain, so you are able to visit this website if you'd like to see what's available and whatnot. And I think that's pretty much it. So I think this is moving into questions and comment time. So I might hand it over to, I believe, Logan.
Amazing, thanks guys. That was super informative and useful. And there's been, I'm not sure if you've been watching the chat, there's been lots and lots of questions and a whole bunch of questions on the Q&A. There are a few in the Q&A and we're running out of time, so I might just pick up maybe one or two. There's a question around sort of the nature of authentic assessment, lots of discussions around authentic assessment and how do you define them? Do you have to define it literally against the specific skill set that a student needs in the real world, or can you define it more broadly?
I think it really comes out of the discipline context. So if you think of perhaps engineering, you can think of the kinds of things that an engineer might do. They might write a report, they might have to do some problem solving, that a whole lot of things that the engineer would do in the workplace that aren't reflected in that standard essay style writing that we have often used in a university. So if you think about the context of the discipline, how it would be enacted in the workplace and what kinds of things you'd want to do. For example, business studies has been doing for a long time using case studies. So a case study is the real world, bringing it into the classroom and then pulling it apart, thinking about how you might do it differently and so on. So yeah, it very much comes out of the discipline context. And I saw someone had a question there about a course about academic writing, and clearly that, you know, that is one that will be using the kinds of forms of academic writing, and that's what you'll be doing. That will be authentic in that context. So I wasn't trying to badmouth essays, you know, they have a place, but not as big a place as we've given them. And it's to think about what happens in your discipline, what happens in the context of that workplace, what sorts of things might a student be asked to do when they start work there, and then can you replicate that? Can you do a version of that as your assessment?
On that note, Anne, I believe we're also part of a consortium of universities from Australia. Do you think it'll be good to share what those principles are and maybe a link or?
Yes, okay, I can do that. I can do that later. Can I do that later? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So we also encourage people to join in the conversation. So you can raise your hand, and perhaps if you have some questions, you can join us with audio as well. Okay. I think there is a question here from Joseph about, are nonverbal forms of communication still relevant in the online learning? Would not the facial expression be more helpful or irrelevant, for example? So because Canvas do have such features that would allow recording as well.
Right. So are your facial, is the question then, are your facial expressions on a recording still relevant?
So, yeah.
I can't think why they wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Have I missed the point?
Okay. I think they're saying that especially at this time, nonverbal forms of communication is much more relevant. Okay, so rather than perhaps an essay, I think some teachers even practice instead of essays, then having their students do video recording, and that would be
Yes.
an alternative of their essays.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've got people using that as a form of assessment, recording group discussions, recording any numbers of things. Yeah, yeah. The technology can sometimes be a challenge. I mean, I saw an earlier question about students using their phone, and we have that same challenge too, where students don't have, I've got two screens in front of me now, a big one with you all on it and a small one with my notes. And, you know, I'm very well provisioned here, but there are students who are doing this on a mobile phone. And that, you know, we need to think about that too, those accessibility issues too.
Okay, so there's a quick question here. Which do you value most in assessing students' performance, summative assessment or formative assessment? I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, well, the students value summative because that gives them the mark. And there's this saying that assessment is the cash nexus of learning. So it's where they get the payoff. It's where they put all their energy in and they get a mark, and the mark will sit on their degree, and that will have a big impact on their future. So for students, it's about summative assessment. But if we're going to value learning, then we should equally value formative assessment, because that's where we're giving them feedback, we're commenting on the evidence of their learning, and we're building their learning. We're looking at opportunities to increase their understanding. So I think we should value both, but our students really, they want the marks.
That's true. Okay. Students can be very grade conscious at times. Okay, and finally, I guess we can squeeze in one more question from Pat Lazaro. What do you think of students preparing their own questions for the quizzes or other exams? Meaning, can they play a role even in the assessment process?
Absolutely. We've just run a series of workshops on co-constructing rubrics. So building rubrics with students as a way of getting them to understand what it is we're looking for when we see a good one in terms of their assignments. But certainly there is a wealth of literature of people getting students to write the exam questions. And by writing the exam questions, they indicate how well they've understood what the course is about. And writing quiz questions. I mean, if anyone has tried to write multiple choice questions any more than, say, 4 or 5, you know, it's a challenging job. And so getting students to do that and thinking about not only the right answer, but plausible distractors in the multiple choice question is a great learning experience. So yes, I really endorse that. I think getting students involved in co-creation of the curriculum, of the rubric, of the assessment, this is a journey they're on with you. Yeah, it's not something we're doing to them.
Okay, thank you very much. Logan, go ahead.
Thanks, guys. I really hate to kind of jump in and end the conversation when it's we're getting some really fantastic, valuable questions, but you know, I'm worried Emerson and Anne may have other meetings to jump through.
Yeah.
And everyone else may have something else to jump to as well. But that doesn't mean the conversation ends. Jump on the Facebook group if you guys are on Facebook, the Canvas community in the Philippines. The conversation will continue. The conversation should continue on the Canvas community pages as well. And we really like to encourage you to keep speaking with each other and follow those links. There were some questions on the chat about certificates and things like that. You will get something in the email to recognize your contribution, the time you've invested in your own professional development here. Last but definitely not least, thank you so much, Emerson and Jasper, for coming on board, for preparing for this, for sharing your time and your insights. It's been incredibly valuable. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else here has learned a lot too. And we'll go away and change our practice.
Well, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Logan.
Bye, everyone. Ramsey's